Hello, I'm Sabri Adel Sadi, and I am Francophone Implementation Coordinator at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western. On behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, welcome to our webinar, Exit Pathways Out of Violence for Migrant or Racialized Women with Disabilities. Understanding to Better Support Survivors, presented by Selma Koudry and Isabelle Cardina. I would like to acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehouk, and Chinatown nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. As settlers, we need to acknowledge the advantages that we have, and I would like to express my gratitude toward Mother Earth for the resources that we use, and to acknowledge all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived on this land for at least 15,000 years. Welcome everyone to this captivating webinar, which will be highlighting two important women who are dedicated to the promotion of inclusion and equality. Allow me to introduce Selma Koudry, Executive Director and co-founder of the National Institute for Equity, Equality, and the Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities. Originally from Algeria, Selma moved to Quebec over 27 years ago, where she had an impressive career as a disabled immigrant woman. As an activist, she has worked hard to promote the rights of persons with disabilities by focusing on women and girls. She has promoted equality in the context of discrimination, empowerment, as well as the promotion of social inclusion and civic participation. By adopting a feminist point of view, Selma works hard to have everyone's participation in social justice recognized, including those with disabilities, regardless of their age, gender, or ethnocultural origin. Unfortunately, as a result of a conflict in her schedule, we were not able to have Selma's colleague with us, but Isabelle is here. She is a member of the Quebec Order of Architects, and for more than 30 years, she's been using her knowledge in the area of architecture, and she has an excellent understanding of those who have functional limitations. She focuses on the built environment, and she seeks to join form and function. She works in the area of inclusion in the context of all her work. We're very happy to have these two individuals with us today who will be inspiring and who will talk to us about the creation of a more accessible society for everyone. I will now pass you the floor for a 1-hour presentation. Then Jess and I will be hosting the question period at 2 p.m. Thank you. Thank you, Sabri. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm speaking to you from Montreal, Quebec. So, we are going to talk to you about persons living with disabilities, and especially women. We'll be talking about their exit pathways from violence. We're not going to go into too much detail, but I will try to give you an overview so as to paint a picture of the reality of women and girls living with disabilities. Today, we're going to take a look at the content of our workshop. If we could go to the next slide. So, what are we going to talk about today? We will discuss exit pathways out of violence. We'll talk about obstacles and tools. And first of all, I'd like to introduce myself and my organization. And I will also try to demystify disabilities. I won't go into too much detail, but I will provide certain information pertaining to disabilities. We will then talk about women who are survivors of violence. Our discussions will focus for the most part on racialized and immigrant women, and we will talk about violence in all its forms, violence which women and girls living with disabilities experience. We will then talk about exit pathways out of violence. I will talk about some obstacles, and my colleague Isabelle will talk about the tools and levers available. We'll talk about how it's possible to ensure that women can safely leave situations of violence. And of course, I will talk to you about certain realities, and our discussions will focus on efforts to strengthen women's voices, women living with disabilities. And as Sabri said, I identify as a woman living with a disability who is also an immigrant. Of course, I don't represent all women, but often I use myself as an example. I have a visual limitation. I have some difficulty with my visions, and sometimes it's hard for people to realize this. And perhaps at times I will hesitate in reading some of my slides or do things from memory. So if I could have your indulgence. So we'll now introduce the organization which I co-founded along with two other magnificent women, Erel Lepine and Anjari, Madame Anjari, who both supported me. And we identified a number of obstacles together, as well as situations of exclusion of persons living with disabilities. And this comes out of 25 years of work with this particular population. So we created the National Institute for Equity, Equality, and the Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I will now tell you about our organization. It's a very new organization. It's existed since November 2018. And it provides quite a number of special programs. We work to eliminate all forms of violence and discrimination toward persons living with disabilities, regardless of their age, gender, or their ethnocultural origin. And we focus a lot on one's ethnocultural origin. We are an institute that seeks to promote equity to achieve equality for everyone. We very much focus on equality. We also use an intersectional approach as well as the human development model for the production of disabilities. If we could just go back one slide, because I think we're going a little bit fast with the slides for me. So we use these approaches for the purpose of providing three important programs. We try to intervene, provide support, and support and prevent all forms of violence. We also work in the area of promotion and advocacy. We also do some work in the area of lobbying. I'm sorry, there are some windows opening on my screen with my limitations. It's getting a little bit hard for me. So now you can understand how I, as a woman with a disability, sometimes have issues. So we work to promote positive spaces which are egalitarian, inclusive, and safe for everyone. We can go to the next slide now. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our approaches. As I said, we work using the following approaches. For example, a feminist approach within an intersectional analysis framework. We also used gender-based analysis, GBA+, and the terminology is different depending on where you are. In Canada, I'm in Quebec, so in Quebec, we use a different acronym. And so ADS plus is basically the same thing, but in Quebec, that's how we talk about GBA plus. The plus sign has been added to indicate that we use an intersectional approach. And another important thing for us is the human development model for the disability creation process. And I'm going to explain how we use these approaches in the area of advocacy and in order to empower those living with disabilities, especially girls and women from various different groups of the population. We can move forward. I'll now talk a little bit about the intersectional feminist framework. And of course, there were people before Kimberly Williams Crenshaw who in 1989 started promoting this framework. And she was involved in advocacy for the Black community in the United States, and this approach spread throughout the world. So it is an intersectional feminist framework which we use. And for us, this framework, and for those who use it, it allows us to understand how multiple forces intersect and interact to reinforce situations of inequality, inequity, and social exclusion. And we will explain this in more detail a little bit later. We also need to be aware as an institute, and all our allies need to be aware of this as well. That is to say, to be aware of dominant factors such as socioeconomic status, ethnic origin, ability, limitations, gender reality, and sexuality. And so all of these factors are important. We also use this approach to better explain the combination of these factors with broader systems of power, which are often dominant in many societies, or perhaps within a certain group. That is to say, how these discrimination and power systems, past and present, and perhaps future ones, and of course, colonialism is a past phenomenon, and during our land acknowledgement, we acknowledge the reality of Indigenous persons in Canada, and there's also the concept of globalization, which allows us to see that there are inequalities simultaneously created between individuals and a society. These are not my definitions. We didn't create these definitions. These are definitions that come from the Canadian Institute for the Advancement of Women, and this organization has been working since the 1970s to promote women's rights, and this organization uses the feminist framework. And we can move forward. So here is an image of the intersectional approach, and perhaps it's a little bit hard to see, But we often use this wheel in order to explain that the real situations that people experience and how these situations can bring about a situation of inequality or exclusion for any person and a person from any group. So there's the individual who is at the center of everything, and there are all the things that surround the individual, for example, the inclusion or the exclusion of the person. So we can go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk about this in too much detail. So I will now demystify disabilities a little bit. And again, these are not my definitions. I'm going to be using definitions that have been developed since the 1970s, since the creation of the social movement, which was happening in North America and Europe for women's liberation. And persons with disabilities are also trying to put an end to the charity and the medical models because we've been limited by these models. Disabilities were seen as linked to health problems, and we want to adopt a more social model. So I'll explain that to you a little bit. So, for a definition, and in fact, we use the definition from the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been promoted by the United Nations. It's existed since 2006, and it seeks to recognize the rights of persons with disabilities. It's also a question of the ability of these people to exercise their rights as disabled persons. There were human rights, but persons with disabilities weren't included in the definition. So since 2006, this convention represents individuals with disabilities, individuals with disabilities. Often when we introduce them, we see them as people with physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory limitations. And these phenomena may be permanent or temporary. Over the course of time, we have also started talking about situations which can occur at a certain time in one's life and things that can also disappear or perhaps continue. The interaction between all of our characteristics as individuals and also everything that represents our realities as individuals living with disabilities. As I, of course, mentioned, I have a visual limitation, and sometimes the external environment, whether it's the social or architectural one, these things interact with my reality as a person with a visual impairment, and it may create a situation of exclusion or create obstacles which can bring about the exclusion of individuals living with disabilities. It also may limit the ability of these persons to exercise their rights within our society. So that's what the convention says. The convention has been ratified by Canada. So Canada seeks to make sure that all of the content of this convention is put into place in order to eliminate obstacles, whether they're architectural or otherwise, and the provinces are also obliged to do the same thing. There are various policies that have been put into place to eliminate obstacles, whether it's in Quebec, Ontario, or elsewhere in Canada. So we can go to the next slide. So this is just to explain what I just mentioned. That is to say, the definition of a disability. We talked about individuals' realities, we talked about impairments, limitations, or illnesses, and we can also add something else to this: exclusionary environments or attitudes, attitudes of the people around us or in our society at large. These things together create a disability. So that doesn't mean that the limitation disappears. Of course, the limitation will always be there. But we need to take into consideration all of these realities, whether it's the obstacles that we face on a daily basis, environmentally, or within our society. This can bring about our exclusion as persons with disabilities. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the human development model for the disability creation process. This is a very important model for us, which we use often to explain people with disabilities' reality. So this concept was developed in Quebec by Dr. Patrick Fujirella and his team from the International Network for Persons with Disabilities. And this model has existed since 2013. And you can see that this is related to the content of the convention. Here we're talking about identifying obstacles and facilitators, whether they're environmental or social, which may bring about participation in our society or exclusion. And I'll explain that a little bit further. If we could go to the next slide, please. So here, I'm going to talk to you about personal factors. There are organic systems. As individuals, we have our own organic systems, all of the components of our bodies. And this may be the source of a limitation. For example, in my case, I have a visual impairment. There are also the activities of daily living, that is to say, dressing ourselves, leisure activities, and it's important to take these into consideration if we're working in this space so as to optimally support a person living with a disability. There are also aptitudes. An aptitude is a person's ability. Sorry, there are a lot of messages coming up on my screen. It's the ability of a person to perform a physical or mental activity. That is to say, for example, going to school. There are also environmental factors. That is to say, everything that's outside of our control. So this is our social environment, our architectural environment, and so on. All of these realities interact together to create a situation of social participation or a situation of exclusion. That is to say, a situation involving a disability. And I'll explain that a little bit more. If we go to the next slide, please. So, what exactly is this model? We spoke about personal factors, and there's also the question of the interaction of these factors, the interaction of all of these realities, one's activities of daily living, one's personal factors, environmental factors, and when there's a negative interaction, for example, I face many obstacles in terms of my environment, I therefore am limited in my ability to perform certain activities of daily living. And so this can create a disability situation for me or an exclusionary situation. So all of these realities can occur, but my personal factors remain the same. So I can work to improve my activities of daily living, and I can seek to have access to all the things that will make my activities of daily living easier. We can also work on environmental factors, that is to say, eliminating all obstacles. And for example, taking a bus here in Montreal, when I first arrived in Canada, it was very difficult to take the bus and to get off the bus. It was very stressful, and often I'd have to ask for the driver's assistance. But now, since there's been a certain elimination of these problems, things have improved, and as a person, this reassures me. Now I can know where I have to go without having to ask anyone's assistance, and this creates a situation of social participation for me. And without these accessibility measures, a disability situation can be created. And if we move forward in a positive fashion, we can create participation for everyone. For me, I can work, I can go to school, I can exercise my rights or my obligations, I can vote. And so this means equality for me along with all the other members of the population. So we need to work hard to eliminate these limitations. Of course, our personal limitations will always remain, and the reality of a person can, of course, vary immensely. So I know that this perhaps seems a little bit complicated, but we explain this a little bit, quite a bit better during our workshops. We provide training and we explain these things in much more detail. Next slide.
Selma, sorry, could you speak just a little bit more slowly? Yes, fine. I was planning to go faster. Okay, but I'll try. So, some terminology. I'm not going to give you all the solutions today, but there is some terminology that can be used. For instance, in community organizations, or perhaps there are things that you've heard, we use we often hear handicapped people. It's not unacceptable, but we prefer persons living with disabilities, motor limitations of physical disability, or persons living with visual or auditory limitations. You can say in French, a deaf person or a hard of hearing person, then their sensory limitations, visual limitations. You can say a blind person or a person with visual impairments. And we talk about people rather than someone who's mentally ill. We prefer talking about not people with psychological problems. We talk about people who have challenges with mental health or mental illness challenges. And finally, for you often hear intellectual deficiency. It's acceptable, but it leads us back to a medical model. So we prefer to use the word limitation. And finally, you hear about persons with autism and neurodiverse people. In the final analysis, it's the person, him or herself, who decides how they want to be described or describe themselves. I am the person who describes myself. If I don't talk about limitations, it's because I don't want to. You have to make sure that the person tells you how they want you to identify their limitation. Next slide, please. Of course, right attitudes are important. Encourage our allies and our people who work with us to not identify the person by their disability. Often we hear a handicapped person, a blind person, a deaf person. No, no, no. This is this is discriminatory language. It's better to call us a person first. The word person should come first, and it It's not, and that helps when you're communicating with us. And it's good to use more respectful language, like, for instance, a person with a disability, a person with a hearing limitation, a person using a wheelchair or using a white cane. But you don't have to have all this terminology. Just by saying a person living with disabilities, uh, it's the person who's going to who will then tell you, I am blind or I am deaf, but you should always leave the choice up to the person, him or herself or themselves. So there, so these are some of the good habits we encourage amongst the people who work, in particular, frontline workers in the shelters, in police office, at the police station. It's important to speak to the person respectfully. Next slide, please. Now, here are some statistics. I'm not going to go into great depth. These are recent statistics from dating back to December 2023. Unfortunately, things have increased in this. The survey was, I'm sorry, the survey was done in 2021, and in 2021, 27% of the population said they had one or more disabilities. It's important to note this. We use the word disabilities a lot because at the federal level, this is the term that you hear most. Sometimes you might hear handicaps or limitations, but as I said, these disabilities can be permanent, temporary. It all depends. And it's important to note that more than half of these people are girls and women, in particular over the age of 15. Now, in Quebec, this is the only example I'm giving, there's almost 20% of the population, over 1 million people, that said that they have one or several disabilities. And once again, according to these statistics, if you can go to our site and see that the prevalence of that there are more limitations or disabilities amongst women than men, and so more women have disabilities. This study was conducted within a GBA plus framework, and this is from Statistics Canada, of course. At the federal level, this kind of analysis, the GBA plus, is used to provide differentiated statistics, and the plus in, uh, includes persons with disabilities, with or from different racial origins, but this plus here includes trans and non-binary people. This is the way Statistics Canada approached it. And so this gives you an idea of the reality in Canada, and no doubt in the provinces where you live. But you may have other statistics that are that apply more to your specific province. These statistics are Canada-wide. Now, next slide, please. So now let's go to the heart of the issue: disability and women survivors of violence. Of course, here we're going to talk in particular about migrant women and racialized women, but also the situation in general for these women. So next slide. Who are these women? They're women like all others. They have the same wants and concerns and needs, the same aspirations, but they are women who live with one or several disabilities, and they are twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence or violence in all its forms than women in general. This has been statistically proven. These The last study that was done in 2014, but there hasn't been a lot of research done on women with a disability who are experiencing violence. We it's the organizations that work with these women who see really what they're experiencing. So these are women like all other women, but the more of them live in a violent context setting. And as I said before, they may have one or more limitations. There are many different kinds. They can be immigrant people, racialized women, in particular refugees, new arrivals, and these are women who also have challenges with accessing decent housing and services. There are a lot of roadblocks, a lot of obstacles that women with a disability encounter. Once again, women with a disability, as I said before, are twice as likely to be institutionalized. Many more are in institutions at the provincial and the Canadian level. If people say, no, this no longer exists, no, there are women who are institutionalized. This study was done in 2005, but what we see is that when women want to get out of a toxic relationship or a violent relationship, there are obstacles, and the shelters are not always accessible. It's very, very difficult to get out of these relationships. Next slide, please. Vulnerability factors. As each specific group of women has encounters specific types of violence. Women with a disability are not spared this situation. And there are aggravating factors. There's age. Often the violence starts early in life. There, women and children can start experiencing violence at the age of 11. Ethnocultural origins are another vulnerability factor. Then there's the family situation, the financial situation of the person, and or sexual orientation. We've seen this too often. There are myths like women, for instance, women with disabilities have no sexuality. This is untrue. These women live with a partner, they have children, and they too may be victims of intimate partner violence or sexual violence. They are affected by these realities. The level of dependency depends on the disability. Often these women need services, they need workers, they need help at home, in the house, they need support and assistance services, and sometimes they be violence. I'm sorry. Violence can come from people who are supposedly there to help these women. They become the abuser. Many women have told us that living in institutions or at home and getting home care, it's that the attendants, the people who come, the healthcare workers, sexually abuse them and are sometimes sexually violent with them. These experiences have been reported by a number of women, and that's why we say that the aggressor is often closely related to the person and not necessarily people from strangers. Now, there are other Could we change the slide, please? Once again, women become disabled due to violence too, if due to intimate partner violence. This study that you see here was done on women survivors of intimate partner violence are vulnerable to traumatic brain injury. We saw this when you see this when women come to shelters. They they come in with traumatic brain injuries, but we don't but people don't understand it, and often they find that their services are not given to them because they supposedly aren't responding well to the services. But why? Why? What have they gone through? And women who are incarcerated, who are in the criminal justice system, also have these types of brain injuries. And these women must be considered as disabled too. If when you're working with women, remember that 35 to 80% have experienced violence, and there are high rates of traumatic brain injury. You really have to investigate this rather than closing their files and stopping services to them. Next slide, please. Now, I know you all know that intimate partner violence kills. It disables and it kills. And some women who have been in violent situations have developed major disabilities, and and this this is a woman who went through intimate partner violence. She she lived with a disability for almost 10 years of her life, and recently this lady asked for medical assistance in dying because she really couldn't continue living independently. So for us, not only does violence create limitations, create disabilities, but it also kills. Next slide, please. And we don't hear we don't hear a lot about disabilities because the frontline service providers don't identify it. These are statistics that date back to 2014. We don't have anything more recent. Hopefully there will be something more recent, but this is from a study on victimization from 2014, and it stated that 39% of women and girls with disabilities experienced the most severe forms of spousal violence. They say 39%, but these are women who spoke out, who blew the whistle and went to the frontline workers and told them. Those who didn't say anything are not included in this statistic. So youth rather, in particular those with developmental disabilities, are more likely to be sexually assaulted than others. And 2 to 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than other children. And it starts very early, as I mentioned. It can even start at 11 years of age. So forms of gender-based violence uh, there are many different forms. It's what you see for women in general. And there are aggravating factors that can create more vulnerability, as I said earlier on: age, ethno-cultural origin, and the limitations the person has, the extent of the disability. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here. These are what women themselves have said. We did focus groups in 2022 and 2023 where we talked to immigrant racialized women who talked about what violence meant to them. Many said that it was difficult getting out of violence because the life trajectory was difficult. There were myths and prejudices. There were women's specific situations. They doubted uh, themselves and their abilities. You hear this quite often, especially in a marriage. Then there was institutional violence, also systemic violence, and an additional effort was required on a daily basis for women just to continue to survive, ask for services, get access to services that are normally accessible to anyone. It's much more difficult for women with a disability who are racialized or immigrant. And as I said, it can start very early in life. Even the mother might be in a violent situation, and the children then live in such a situation. These are all things that women said about their lives when, and often it's hard to get women to talk about what they've experienced because they're afraid. So they use the words that come to their minds, uh, and we asked them what they thought about when they thought of violence. There was manipulation and family violence, a lack of autonomy. I'm dependent on the family. And in particular, young women are not free. They have no personal choice. They can't make decisions for themselves, in particular when they come from certain ethnocultural backgrounds. So next slide, please. Here, we're going to talk about violence in all its forms. I'm sure I'm not teaching you anything new. You have a lot of information on this. This is violence that we've seen. This is the kind of violence that women have talked about. They talk about economic violence. They talk about societal violence, attitudes, social norms, how society sees them, opportunistic violence, systemic violence. These are their words. We listen to them. And it's important to take into account what they say because this is what they've experienced or what they see others experiencing. There's destabilization of the couple, rejection. As soon as there's a disability, women are rejected. Often women who've been subject to sexual violence can't describe it in words, and perhaps they don't want to because they're afraid of being rejected. The abuser is often the spouse or the person with whom they live, and often they're afraid of being rejected, so they don't blow the whistle. Now, an absence of representation. We don't see a lot of women role models, women with disabilities who are role models, who have succeeded in life, who are part of society, but they're not visible enough. And women want role models and want to be better represented in order to be able to talk about their reality. And thanks to representation, changes come about. And we we don't want to talk only talk about negative statistics, but also positive ones where women are participating in society. Next slide. So different forms of violence, as I said, there's always psychological and verbal violence. A lot of women experience this, in particular, immigrant women with disabilities. They hear hurtful words from members of the family or from the spouse, be it a man or a woman, and this is a reality that they're always living with. Then there's post-separation violence or IPV. And it often continues after separation because these women have children. So it becomes a continuum of violence. Then there's institutional violence. It's very important to identify it, to name it, because women here in Quebec in long-term care homes, for instance, or in homes for seniors uh, are in these shelters or in these homes for elderly people, even if they're not particularly elderly themselves. And there is violence in these institutions, in particular sexual violence. It's the beneficiary attendants, for instance, who are violent towards them. This is what the women have told us. Then there's the restriction of mobility aids, or to deprive women of, for instance, their support animals or their white canes or their wheelchairs, things that women use for their mobility every day. Sometimes the abuser holds them back to these aids to exercise even further power over them. Then there's the deprivation, as I mentioned before, of support animals, for instance, guide dogs for women who have a visual impairment. Often the abuser uses the guide dog as a way to control the woman. Then there's financial violence. A lot of women with disabilities are in precarious financial situations. They're amongst the most poor members of society within uh, the population. These women with disabilities have limited access to the labor force. Often they find themselves without sufficient financial means, and they continue to have to depend on their families or on their spouse. And often the woman has her own money, but it's taken over by the spouse who controls everything, and she has no control over it. And she's afraid that if she talks, he'll leave. So she continues to live in this situation. As I mentioned, there were sexual and physical violence too, and racism and ableism. Ableism is not recent, but we've heard a lot about it recently because it's a type of discrimination based on ability in our society is built for people who are able, um, even though not everyone in society does have the same abilities. So there are many obstacles in our lives. So, and finally, homophobia. As I said earlier, women in particular are seen as not as being asexual. This is untrue, though, and so they may be subject to intimate partner violence or homophobia. Next slide, please. So once again, at the crossroad of oppressions, intersectionality helps us to understand this. There, even within the family, there are power systems, and women find themselves at the crossroads of these different types of oppression, be it the family, those around them, or societal structures, power structures, deny women's ability to exercise their rights. Women with disabilities find themselves limited in their autonomy, be it financial or other, and being limited in their right to free and informed choice. For instance, a woman or a young woman might ask for medical services, might ask for birth control or the pill, and she's refused it. This is a situation where ableism comes into play because there are prejudices. Why do you want this? You are not a sexual being. Or she's prevented from having a sexual life because she has a limitation and no one wants her to have sexual relations. There's often persons with disabilities are often controlled in this area. Then there's education. There's a lack of access to education. Many disabled persons with disabilities, racialized women or immigrant women are limited in their access to education. Sometimes there are women who have a great deal of education, women with masters and doctorates, but no work experience. And their knowledge is not valued. They're not given any opportunities to flourish, and there's a lack of access to the labor market. This is often their reality, which pushes them into poverty. Then there's leisure time. It's difficult for racialized and migrant women, and it's important to say this. Uh, we we haven't grown up in a situation. We here don't necessarily know what it's like to have access to leisure activities, for instance, access to basic services. Basic health services can be very difficult too. Then there's dependency, as I mentioned, and exclusion. These are all, when I talk about the crossroads of oppression, all these types of oppressions can be experienced by women. There are many others that I could mention, but I just wanted to give you an example of a few. Next slide, please.
Selma, it's 2 o'clock. Yes, I will try to finish up. Can I just ask you to finish after your next slide so as to leave some time for Isabelle? Yes. So if we take a look at exit pathways out of violence, if we go to the next slide, there are significant obstacles, but there are also architectural obstacles, social obstacles. There's a lack of service and support. There's a lack of frontline services for women living with disabilities, whether they're immigrant women or racialized women. So, in order that these women can leave these situations, we need to provide them with these services. So, I'd like to ask my colleague to now talk to us a little bit about strategies for ensuring these exit pathways. Thank you, Selma. So, I will get to the point on every slide. I'm Isabelle Cardinal. So for the next part of our presentation, I'm going to talk about universal design and more specifically how it can be used as a lever for exit pathways out of violence for women with disabilities. So I'll tell you about Société Logique, an organization that I've worked for more than 30 years. We are a not-for-profit, and our mission is to make the environment universally accessible. When we speak about in the environment, we mean city planning, architecture, urban planning, and of course housing. So Société Logique, to summarize, is an organization that specializes in universal design and making things accessible in Quebec. Next slide, please. This is just to link my presentation to what Selma was just speaking about. Certain relevant points, the intersection of oppressions, which has to do with the concept of intersectionality. There's an increased risk of victimization of persons with disabilities, particularly women and girls. Spousal violence experienced by women with disabilities is a problem that's poorly understood, and there's very little research in the area. And this is sometimes explained by the notion that these women are asexual or they're not interested in being in a relationship. There are also a number of shelters that experience difficulty in housing women with disabilities, especially in the area of communication, crisis management. There's also a certain physical inaccessibility of the premises, And there's also the fact that these people's needs are poorly understood. So we need to make sure that housing, whether it's permanent or temporary, be able to provide a safe place to live, and it also needs to be an environment that is adapted and inclusive. We, of course, see housing as a safe place to live, but the idea of making things accessible sometimes is something that is forgotten. And universal design can serve as a lever to allow one to break free from violence. Next slide. So, we're going to talk about the impact of discrimination in the area of structural and architectural discrimination. So, here are two, two images. So, women with disabilities, whether they're racialized or immigrant, may face a number of forms of discrimination, which has to do with this intersection of oppression. There's sexism, racism, ableism, and so I'll explain these things well. There's structural discrimination, as you can see on the left, or architectural discrimination, which you can see on the image on the right. These two forms of discrimination coexist in our society. Structural discrimination on the left. I'll just explain this image. Well, we talk about structural discrimination when there's an inequality of the treatment of people. And this inequality exists as a result of societal organization. And when we talk about architectural discrimination, we talk about the fact that the built environment brings about a segregation of a group of individuals, preventing them from accessing certain places or preventing them from accessing these sites in the same way that other people can access them. So I think the images explain what I just said quite clearly. So now we're going to talk about the impact of these forms of discrimination. We'll give you a little bit of data. According to Quebec's Public Health Agency, 25.8% of women with disabilities have experienced emotional abuse, and 8% financial abuse, compared to 3.6% of women without disabilities. So these are quite, there's quite a striking difference between the two. There are significant gaps in shelter accessibility in terms of one's ability to access shelter. In 2009, only 54% of shelters had a wheelchair accessible entrance. 41% had accessible bathrooms, and 39% had adapted bedrooms. And finally, in terms of percentages, well, we were talking a little bit more about accessibility with respect to those in wheelchairs, but 9% of these facilities offered specialized services to people with visual disabilities. So, a lot of numbers, but these numbers are quite striking. So we'll move on to the next page where there's a little bit more data to show you. Ashida Manju, UN rapporteur on violence against women in 2012, emphasized the fact that inaccessibility of shelter structures may force women to live on the street or to return to an abusive environment. There are difficulties in accessing accessible housing. This is very much the case for people with disabilities, and it may coincide with the context of violence. There's also a lack of a directory of emergency resources. For example, information on the degree of adaptation or accessibility of infrastructure. So the fact that this directory doesn't exist, it perpetuates women's difficulty in leaving abusive situations. And in terms of obstacles to accessibility, that have been identified by shelters, well, there is a lack of financial resources, there's a lack of capacity, and a lack of knowledge and time. So these are all obstacles to accessibility in terms of accessibility to shelter. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about universal design, which is very much at the heart of the work of Société Logique. Essentially, it's a way to deal with architectural obstacles. So here you can see some photos of the entrances to buildings, just to show you what universal design is, and it's represented by the image on the right. So I'll start with the one on the left, just to show you ways that we can overcome architectural obstacles. So on the left, you can see that this is a building which was built without taking into consideration accessibility. So the entrance has been adapted so as to allow someone in a wheelchair to enter. But this requires a manual intervention. Something needs to be added in order to allow someone to access this building. And this thing that's been added isn't necessarily practical for everyone. In the middle, the image shows the concept of accessibility. So you can see there's a ramp and a staircase. Yes, this is an entrance which is accessible, but it shows the way that we consider accessibility even today to be a strategy where we offer different strategies for those with limitations. So there's the staircase for everyone else, and then there's the ramp for those with limitations, and it's good because it allows people to access the building. In terms of universal design, well, we need to change the way that we think about the environment and architecture by imagining all the people who may want to come to a certain place. And so from the start, design needs to take into consideration the idea that there be no obstacles. It's really a change in terms of the way that we see spaces. If we could go to the next slide. Here's a summary of the three concepts that we just spoke about. And I think that the photos were a pretty good explanation of this. So on the left, there was the measure to promote inclusion. We want to identify everyone's needs. We don't want to create any obstacles in the environment. So this needs to be taken into consideration at the design stage, and we should promote an environment which allows everyone to use facilities in the same way. So that's the definition of universal design. So if we could go to the next slide. So I showed you some building entrances. And if you can imagine everything you do on a daily basis, performing an activity is a chain of events. So if we take into consideration someone who wants to access an emergency shelter, well, first of all, the person needs to be able to find the location. They need to know the information about accessibility of this place, and so that's the first obstacle, just getting this information. And then the person needs to reach the actual place. The person may take public transit, a taxi, they may go on foot. So throughout this process to get there, there are many obstacles which may be experienced. Once the person has reached the building, they need to enter into it. And of course, you saw the obstacles with respect to the entrances. Once inside, the person needs to be able to get around, familiarize themselves with the location, be safe, and feel welcomed. So, at each of these steps, there are obstacles which exist in our society and within our built environment, and there are obstacles affecting someone's ability to go to a place, and they may bring about inequalities or inequity among people with functional limitations. Next slide. So, universal design is about creating inclusive spaces that take into account the needs and capacity of as many people as possible to create common accommodations that benefit everyone. I'd like to draw your attention to this expression needs and capacity of as many people as possible, and this will be linked with our next slides. So if we could go to the next slides, where we're going to talk about people. Universal design, of course, takes into consideration the needs of people with more severe and permanent limitations. I'll give you a few examples. So, for example, the second example, in terms of sight, of course, we need to take into consideration the needs of people with permanent visual limitations. So the second line on the left, this is a blind person. And of course, in the environment, there are a number of things that can be done to make this person's ability to get around easier. So in universal design, we need to both meet the needs of someone with a temporary limitation, a person who has cataracts, for example, or a person who's just getting on in age. And we also need to meet the needs of people who have situational limitations. For example, a distracted driver. Imagine that you're in a city, you're not in a building, and if we meet the needs of someone with a visual limitation, of someone who's completely blind, of course, this will also allow us to make many other people's lives easier. And this is the same thing with respect to touch and to one's ability to hear. So if we could go to the next slide, which will establish the link between the whole population, and here you have images of all types of people who find themselves in disability situations, but in a situational manner.
But not necessarily a permanent disability. The idea is to create universally accessible environments, and that makes life better for the whole of the population. Let's move on, which leads me to the next section. And the question is, how does a person with a functional limitation use their environment? And this is related to what we were hearing earlier. Before there was, we use the medical approach. Now there's the social approach for people who move around within their environment and fulfill all their activities of daily living. We know what they are. We go to school, we socialize, we do sports, we clean the house. But people who have a functional limitation are in the same environment. They want to feel safe. They want to decide and act upon on their own and use all available services, carry out all proposed activities, and they want to have the same experiences. Next slide. Now, I'd like to talk about a case study. We worked with Logifam, gave us a mandate. Logifam is an organization that provides housing and support for women with or without children in Montreal. Let's just stay on this slide. I'm explaining what Logifam is. It's an organization committed to providing support and housing that allows them, these women and children, to feel at home, to heal and rebuild their lives. Logifam has 2 shelters, 13 transitional apartments, and a post-shelter follow-up program to support women in their transition from the shelter to permanent housing. And it receives It received support from Société Logique and INE PSH to make one of their shelters accessible. So, uh, uh, underlying our work is the idea that functional impairment can happen at any stage in life, at starting at birth, but it may also come from violence. And we received funding from the government of Quebec to work specifically with women who um, have undergone family violence. Some what what we did was we were asked first to do a feasibility study to evaluate the various obstacles in the shelters as they were, and to make suggestions, proposals. So we presented three options. The option chosen was to move some of the offices to create rooms on the ground floor and to renovate an existing bathroom. This seemed to be the most practical and most economical option. And the funding, there was funding, as I mentioned, from the Quebec government to funding to fund shelters and better adapt their services to the realities of people living in vulnerable situations. Let's move on. After this study and the option that was chosen, a committee was created, a technical committee, to guide the administration through the process. There was Mr. Dalbozic, a former Logifam board member and building engineer, who was a key player. Logifam also worked with the INE PSH and the CIUSSS, that's it was a healthcare, a local regional diversity and inclusion services healthcare center. And this partnership was created to train all the staff. The staff all took training given by Line PSH so that everyone knew how to navigate this project. Now let's look at the different stages and the different steps. First of all, the renovation was done in 2022. The work started in February. At the end of fall 2022, there was a renovated wing with an accessible bathroom and 2 accessible bedrooms. There was there were new front and rear entrances and electronic opening systems on the ground floor and a ramp at the rear of the building, and the 2 rooms, bedrooms, uh, were joined together so a mother could check in on her children, for instance. There was another step. We we worked on the architectural aspects, but then there was also equipment which was purchased, and this analysis was done by the Logifam occupational therapist. Uh, and at the end of 2022, 2 women in wheelchairs were able to move in. Next slide, please. And here, there are a lot of words, but I'm just going to give you, I'm not going to read from the slide. I'm going to just talk to you about the importance of universal design. It's it's great that we did this project and it made the Logifam building more accessible, but the fact that it wasn't accessible at the outset, it was harder to modify and it was quite expensive. When, depending on the level of accessibility of a building, if the building is not accessible, you have to work a lot harder and spend a lot more money to make it accessible. If it had had common areas, for instance, that were more accessible, it would have been easier to do the renovations. Elsewhere in Canada, there are certain provinces and cities that have visitability requirements. This is something new for Quebec. Uh, but to have a place that's minimally accessible so you can receive visitors is a good first step. And and then you can make further adaptations. There there's other housing that where the situation is more a situation of adaptability. There's basic accessibility, and to make it more accessible is less difficult. And for us, the last step is universal design. And that's what we're promoting. We want to imagine and design and build spaces that take into account all the different people who can live there. This allows people to age at home, to bring in people living with disabilities. It's not all persons with disabilities will be able to live there, but what we want to do is create enough accessibility to make further adaptations at the lowest cost possible. And the last slide is my conclusion. I won't read it all to you, but with respect to regulations and accessibility in Quebec, there there has been legislation created. There's a lot of legislation, a lot of regulations to improve accessibility. However, we're dealing with existing buildings that were built at a time when when people didn't have the same concerns as they do today. So there's still a lot of work that remains to be done, making people aware of this situation, influencing decision makers. If we want to have some influence on the building code and all the rules, we there's going to be a lot of work to do. We're not going to lose our jobs very soon, because at the current time, the standards and regulations are currently inadequate. So that's my presentation. I went through it quite fast. I'm just looking at the time, it's already 2:27. Thank you, Selma Elizabeth. It was very interesting. We're just going to take one question because time is flying by. The question that came out most often was a question about the future. People would like to know, over the next 20 years, what kind of specific changes are you hoping for in terms of accessibility, in terms of support and intervention for women with disabilities who are immigrants, racialized people? We'd like to hear what your hopes are and what you think will be able to be done in the next 20 years. Of course, I'm going to see it through from an architectural point of view. Yeah, it's really important to understand, says Selma, the reality of people who are immigrants and racialized people. This is a major segment of the population, and we have to create alliances with these people with disabilities and think about the interventions that we use. They have to be adapted too, not just the architecture. We have to look at how we offer these people support, how we receive them. They can't It's not just a question of shelters. There are different ways of supporting and assisting these people and working to eliminate violence. We always also have to work with the members of the family and spouses to work on prevention and make them aware of violence and unacceptable behavior. And this has to be done with everyone and not just with the person who's experienced violence. Over the next 20 years, says our friend the architect, I hope regulations will change. We can't make an accessible world just through goodwill and consciousness raising. We need incentives and sometimes coercive change in the world of architecture. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Selma and Isabel, to have been with us today, and all the participants on the webinar. Thanks to Wendy and Peter, our English interpreters, our LSQ interpreters, our ASL interpreters. You will now be seeing an evaluation in your browser, and then you will get your certificate of participation. Thanks to all of you, and on behalf of CREVAC, have a nice day. Thank you.